So while we're waiting, Martha, did you want to say anything about why you and I'll put you on the spot, why you and Nancy wanted to start Boots on the Ground?
Yeah, so we started Boots on the Ground in January after the elections, and we saw a lot of people that wanted to take action but didn't know what to do. So we put together our first event was a volunteer fair where we helped support 44 different nonprofits with people who wanted to volunteer and help. And those were nonprofits impacted by budget cuts and current environment. And then we've moved on to mobilize across Kansas City area, across Kansas, and then doing things like this that are national. So we really just want people to take action and to feel like they are in control and can do something to fix what's going on. So education sessions such as this are great opportunities for all of us to learn more, get a little historical perspective from Professor Drew, and hopefully apply that to our lives going forward in our actions.
I know some of our past presidents, I don't know if Kennedy was one of them that said, in order to understand what's happening in the world today, we have to know something about history. Am I right on that, Professor Drew? Was that Kennedy or who said
I'm
that?
not an Americanist, but that's a very common belief. I think we're ready to go. I think we're at time.
Yeah, let's go. I'm
Should we
going to
get
mute
started?
myself.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining Boots on the Ground Midwest. I'm Janet Milkovich, a volunteer on the board here, and along with our co-founder of Boots on the Ground Midwest, Martha Lawrence. We're a grassroots organization that mobilizes and motivates the community in response to a crisis in our federal government. Action is power, right? And speaking of power and the threatened loss of power, Dr. Andrew Stewart Bergerson, will address the fascist social contract, dupes and the liars they believe. And Dr. Bergerson is a historian of modern Germany and taught in France, Germany, and Taiwan prior to coming to the University of Missouri in Kansas 30 years ago. He's also written several books, including Ordinary Germans and Extraordinary Times. Before we jump in, we invite you to use chat and tell us where you are from. While you do that, we're going to confess to 3 assumptions that we have made about those of you that are joining us tonight. We believe that you are alarmed by the elimination of DEI funding, limitations on free speech, restrictions on news reporting, and elimination of funding for public television. We believe that you desire unvarnished truth from someone who's reputable and knowledgeable, like our speaker tonight. I had to choose my word carefully there, and that you value historical perspectives. So Professor Bergerson is going to speak to these things as they relate to fascism. To avoid distractions, please post your questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat. Also, we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of this presentation. The professor has offered to stay a little bit longer if the questions run over. And lastly, we expect consideration and respect for our esteemed speaker and one another. Let's model the behavior that we desire to see in Washington, D.C. Professor Drew, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go. Next slide, please.
Well, let's try it again.
There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today from a book that the book called The Happy Burden of History that was written in 2011 by myself and 3 other scholars, Scott Baker, Concy Martin, and Steve Ostovich. So many of the things I'm going to tell you today come from them and not from me, but it was a collaboratively written work. We are historians, literary critics, philosophers, and theologians. And we wrote the book because even before 2011, we were confronted by a question. We had students, when we were talking about fascism or genocide, when they would look at us and they would say, what should we do if we want to stop this, if we want to take responsibility for these horrible events. Next slide, please. So the concept of responsibility is at the center of this book, and the cover depicts Sisyphus, the Greek figure from Greek myth, who did not take responsibility for his actions and then was condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for all of eternity in Hades. This to us seemed like a metaphor for the problem of taking responsibility for something that you can't change, something that happened in the past. It seems like it's a never-ending task that is constantly requiring work and that you're stuck in kind of a perpetual punishment. For young people who were born after the fact, this is a particularly big challenge. They often feel guilty for events. They are often made to feel guilty for events that happened before they were born. And the question is, what should they do about that? What can they do about it? It seemed to us like this was a question that should be asked historically about Nazi Germany, specifically about how people reacted to the crimes that were taking place in the present. What myths did people tell themselves about their roles in fascism and genocide? Next slide. So our research question could be framed in these terms. What does it mean for us as individuals in our everyday lives to act responsibly in the face of either fascist or genocidal systems, both in the past and in the present? And I just want to say that this organization, what I've learned about this organization is that it's primarily focused on collective action, on encouraging people towards collective action. I'm going to be talking today mostly about what it feels like when we as individuals are feeling powerless in this situation. Next slide, please. So we begin the chapter on lies with the emperor's new clothes, the Kaiser's new clothes. Kaiser is the word for emperor. You'll remember the story from Hans Christian Andersen, the fable. The Kaiser was vain, and he let himself be swindled by a group of tailors who promised him a new, beautiful suit, a suit that is totally unique, because it would be invisible to everyone who was stupid or not fit for their post. The Kaiser thought, oh, I'm going to use this as a litmus test to find out who is really good or who is bad at being a minister. But really, the story becomes a test for whether the Kaiser is a good leader or not. You all know what happens next. Everyone, in order to prove that they are fit for their jobs, everyone makes like the Kaiser has clothes, even though he's walking through town completely naked. In other words, everyone collaborates in the lie until an innocent child says, the Kaiser has nothing on at all. And then all of a sudden, everyone realizes that it was a lie, but the Kaiser still pretends that it's the truth. He says, now I must bear it up to the end. Next slide. So in this fable, we see certain key themes in the nature of self-deception, which I'm going to argue is at the heart of a fascist social contract. Self-deception is a lie to the self about the self. Self-deception is social. Who we are on the outside seems to reveal who we are on the inside. For instance, in this case, the Kaiser is vain. But clearly, we're talking about deceptions that we create together. These deceptions are political. When a dupe, clearly the main point of the story is that the dupes in the story, the people who believe the lies, are giving up power to the liars. And the lie spreads through some kind of collusion, and this collusion seems to lack any sense of responsibility for the lie. In other words, this raises also ethical questions. The lies spread and persist so long as people don't take responsibility for those lies. But the real danger here is that the lies get treated, these self-deceptions get treated as if they are natural, as if we really are the people that we pretend to be. In this case, the Kaiser with his new suit. So I'm highlighting those themes so you can see where we're heading in the rest of the chapter. We are focused on the problem of what we call duplicity, which doesn't just mean trickery. We're using it in a different way. We're using it to mean, why do dupes believe liars? Next slide. So let's start with the self. Enlightenment figures like Immanuel Kant from the end of the 18th century believed that lies were always wrong. We all are or should be truth tellers. Next slide. But the four authors of this book are all existentialists. We believe that we're all self-deceivers. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "People lie unspeakably often, but afterwards they do not remember, and on the whole, do not believe it." Next slide, please. Let's take the first example of a lie, a self-deception. So this is the headshot that I took recently last year because I'm starting a new venture, or starting to write fantasy novels as well as writing nonfiction about history. And it helps us to understand the difference between vanity and a vain person. I have moments of vanity like this one where I thought I looked good. A vain person is something different. A vain person is someone who believes the lie as a strong truth. So for instance, here, maybe in my vanity, I believed that I was beautiful, but a vain person would believe that that was an essential truth about themselves. Next slide. So let's piece this lie up into a little bit more carefully so that you can understand where the danger in lying lies. The first order lie is the lie about the lie itself. I am what you say I am. I am beautiful. That's the lie in itself. Next slide. The second order lie is the one I want you to pay attention to. The second order lie is that I then ignore that you just lied to me. And I ignore that I believed you. I now assume that I am naturally what you say I am. This is the strong lie, the lie that I believe because I'm deceiving myself about my own deceptions. I am lying about my own participation in the lie. Next slide. So, in other words, we argue that we make ourselves into dupes when we give the lie, and therefore the liar, mastery over ourselves. In this moment, we act like the Kaiser and say, now I must bear it up to the end. Next slide, please. Here's another example of a lie, the lie of being a poseur. A poseur, French term, is someone who pretends to be what they're not. Now, again, the whole premise of our book is that things like self-deceptions, we're not saying that they're automatically good or they're automatically bad. I know that in the current political atmosphere in the United States, we often say, oh, liars are bad, truth tellers are good. We're trying to get away from those distinctions. And we're trying to say instead that we want to focus on the premise that the self-deception we need to figure out what it is that's wrong when we self-deceive. Friedrich Nietzsche writes, if someone obstinately and for a long time wants to appear something, it is in the end hard for him to be anything else. In other words, from an existentialist perspective, we become what we do. And therefore, we kind of hope that it's going to be good. Next slide. Let me give you an example. This is a photo when I first got to Kansas City as a young professor at UMKC, University of Missouri in Kansas City. But before then, I had been a graduate student and I gave lectures. And I remember very vividly the first lecture I gave in Paducah, Kentucky. I was terrified because I didn't think I was smart enough or capable enough to do the job. I had to deceive myself that I was a professor in order to become a professor. Next slide. There's something inherent about modern individuality that requires self-deception. We want to change ourselves to believe something to ourselves that we are something that we are not in order to get a new job, get married, find a partner, do whatever we want to do. We have to lie to ourselves to convince ourselves that we can do it. But that raises a gigantic problem. What if we change who we are with every person we meet? Does a self even exist then if we are whatever we are, what the other person wants us to be? Bertolt Brecht, the very famous German playwright, wrote a play about this. It's called A Man's a Man. And in it, his protagonist, Gali Guy, becomes whatever people make of him. And he becomes a murderer in the end. Next slide. The topic of murder brings us to fascists. So the first lie that the Nazis told the German people was that they were Aryan supermen. Übermensch, right, is the term. This is actually a term that they stole from Nietzsche and they totally misused. Nietzsche did not even mean it in this way at all. He meant a person who made their own existential ethical choices apart from the morality of their society around them. They used it to refer to a racially, biologically, culturally, politically, in any way superior human being who is opposed by all of these subhuman groups, Jews, Roma, Slavs, who then therefore needed to be moved out of the way, killed, exterminated, deported in order to make room for the Aryans. So this was a lie that Hitler told his people. Next slide. Another lie that Hitler told, this was less explicit, but it was built into everything that he did in all of his politics, was what we call sovereign impunity. Sovereign impunity is the belief, in this case, that Aryans have the right to conquer and kill without concern for the suffering of their victims. So this was part and parcel of the Nazi policy also for Lebensraum, for living space, that they then used to justify the conquest and destruction of most of Europe. Next slide. Both of these lies are what we call anticipatory memories. Anticipatory memories are stories, you could even call them myths, that we tell ourselves in advance to justify our unethical actions. We tell ourselves these stories because we want to thrive in this unjust society in which we live, for instance, in Nazi society. But we also tell these stories so that we can, at some time in the future, look back on our actions as an ethically coherent person. We want to tell a story of ourselves that's going to be convincing later in life. Next slide. So this brings us to the fascist social contract. The fascist social contract is a relationship of liars and duplicity between the leader, the Führer, and his people. The main point I want to drive home about this fascist social contract is that it's not just about the leader. I think a lot of historians spend a lot of time focusing on Hitler and thinking about, was he believing what he said? How could he have lied so many times? He lied all the time. He lied. In all these ways, his ideology, his psychology, his breaking of trust, all of these things, the historians tend to focus solely on what Hitler was doing. And I think it's much more important to focus on what the believers were doing. The dupes were not bystanders. They were active subjects. The core element of a fascist social contract is not the liar, but the people who believe the lies, that first order of lies, and then the people who ignore their own role in their self-deceptions and accept the lie as a strong truth about themselves and the world. Next slide. So let's address this question of whether or not Hitler was a sincere deceiver or not. I believe that he was. I believe that he lied so many times that he believed his own lies. But again, not really the core element of a fascist social contract. There will always be liars in the world. That's not a problem. We know that people lie. The question is, why did so many Germans believe these lies, accept them as strong truths? because only when they ignored their own role in their self-deceptions were they then going to fight to the bitter end. They're going to hold out like the Kaiser did and keep and stick to their own lies. Next slide. So I think one of the key elements, one of the questions that people ask me often is, why did ordinary Germans fight to the bitter end? Why did they stick to the lies that the Nazis told them? And I think we have to imagine the Nazi regime as as an organized crime syndicate, whether you can imagine a gang or a mafia kind of situation. Um, they intentionally get blood on the hands of their collaborators, so that everyone is part of the criminal enterprise. And the more that that criminal enterprise then causes actual human suffering, the harder it is for you to break out of the gang, right? Because everyone knows that you were part of engaging in the criminal activities. So the lie is the first intellectual step, but then the next step is to then see human suffering that results from the lie, and then the dupe has to bear up to the end and keep fighting to the end and stick to their leader. Next slide. Hannah Arendt, a very famous Jewish German philosopher, also a refugee from Nazi Germany. She writes in The Human Condition, "Be careful when you commit murder, because you will be living with a murderer for the rest of your life." Next slide. There's a third lie, and I'd like to take the remaining time that I have, and Janet and Martha will tell me when I need to stop. There's a third lie about ordinary people. And this lie is the lie that we are powerless to do anything about these lies. Next slide, please. So here I'll very briefly tell the story of Hans F., who I did interviews with in one of my first interview partner in the 1990s when I was still a graduate student. He taught at my mother's school on Long Island. He was born in 1926 in Firth. He was a Methodist, and he joined the Hitler Youth. He was pressured, even though he was kind of an outsider, because he was very physically fit. He fit the model of an Aryan, and most young people were pressured to join. Next slide, please. He admitted to liking the strenuous life. He did many activities for the Hitler Youth along with his peers, and then he joins the army in 1943 because he was forced to. He fought with an anti-aircraft battalion. And during the interviews, Hans identified very strongly with the victims. He described recoiling in horror at the night of broken glass. He also described the brutality of the SS, who during one of the basic training exercises that he was engaged in, an officer forced them to march 25 kilometers or miles, and then swim in a cold river, and imagine that they were crossing the Volga River against the Soviet Union. And his feet were so blistered from the long march when the SS officer then forced them to march across stubbled grass, which then caused enormous pain, and this SS officer seemed to relish the pain. And Hans tells this story because he likes to depict himself as an anti-Nazi, that he hated the Nazis in the end. Next slide, please. But in other stories, he describes himself again and again as incapable of action. So this is true when he was younger and living in Germany, but also as a soldier. He tells a story when he was a POW. He was helping a Spanish POW who was an amputee, who was in crutches, and this POW was struck by an American GI, and he got very angry. So after he helped his fellow POW into a camp, he almost confronted this GI, but then he decided he was going to not do anything, and he was going to be passive because he was worried that he would get killed or something. There would be the American GI would react with violence. And this is the way that Hans tells his story. I don't have time now to tell all the other examples, but he depicts himself as necessarily passive, forced by circumstances to not do anything. Next slide, please. And yet he was busy helping the Nazis for several years. So this is another kind of lie. This is the lie that says that we are incapable of action and we are just ordinary people. We can do nothing because we're one lone individual. Next slide. There's this really great story about an incident with Henry Kissinger. Um, when he was a boy in Firth, he lived right next door to Henry Kissinger, or at least he claims he did. And a soccer ball would fly over the wall between the Jewish part of the neighborhood and his Christian part. And the question was how Hans responded. And Hans felt the expectation that he should go over there and beat up these boys, the Jewish boy, because he's an Aryan. He also felt his Christian obligation to be kind to these people. And in the end, he decided he would just go over, hand the ball, and walk away. So again, in depicting this story, he recognized his own ordinariness, his own inability to alter the circumstances of his life that he disagreed with. But this story, which came out in 1983, I believe, when Henry Kissinger went back to Firth, 83, I think that year's wrong. I'm not remembering correctly. Hans started to critically reflect on his own self-deceptions. And he started to wonder whether he had been lying to himself all the time. And most importantly, Hans did this in public. He spoke at his school to anyone, to people like me, telling this story and saying, I wonder whether I really did the right thing. Next slide. So this brings me to the conclusion of my talk, and then we can get to questions. What does Hans's example tell us about responsible selfhood? First of all, it teaches us that, like Hans, we should be very mindful of our self-deceptions, particularly when fascists are trying to solicit our duplicity and believing their lies. So that is an important aspect of opposing fascism. Unlike Hans, though, we need to think critically in advance. He did not at that moment. He knew, he was aware that he was in this ethical dilemma, but he didn't act in a way that he then felt happy about later in his life. So my advice is to not be like Hans and think about it in the present rather than in the past. Choose those self-deceptions that can help all of us to stand on the side of the victims. And remember that responsibility is a never-ending struggle like Sisyphus. What matters is not whether we lie or we don't, but is what we do with our self-deceptions. How do we respond to those actual situations that we are confronted with? Thank you very much. And now I'll take some questions.
Professor Drew, you worked so hard to keep that short, but none of us wanted to end. That was so great. So we do have some questions. One came in right at the end. Do you think we have the capacity in America do we need to learn to be critical thinkers? Have we lost that capacity?
I do think that in the United States, I mean, I've watched what's happened to our students, and one of the big concerns I have is that students struggle with reading. The amount of reading that students can pay attention to due to, I think, social media, but also the incredible pressures on their lives to work and to maintain families and to maintain social lives. And then all of that added together, I think it is hard for people to focus long enough to think critically. So I think that is a difficulty. Um, I think there are lots of critical thinkers in the United States. I think there are lots of people who want to think critically. Um, I, I think that we should use every opportunity we can to have those kinds of difficult conversations and to get informed, like you're doing here on this podcast, about different ways to think through the problems that we face in everyday life.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Do you think, from your knowledge of German history, did many Germans snap out of this fog? And no,
That's the main point of what I'm trying to say is that they stuck with the lies. And the main reasons that I'm trying to argue that ordinary Germans stuck with their lies is, so let's break it out a little bit. The fascists are fascists, and you can't change a fascist if they're born and bred as a fascist. I interviewed this one former Nazi, and she looked me in the eyes and she said, and she was 85 years old, and this was in the 1990s. She said, I don't change my my politics like a shirt. And
Mm.
she was very derisive of, she said, admitted to me, she still believes the things that she believed in her youth. So I think most of the scholarship shows that a person who's a committed fascist is going to remain a committed fascist. Don't waste your energy trying to convince them otherwise. I think that would be true, by the way, of any political ideology. If you have someone
Mhm.
who's a dyed-in-the-wool member of that political ideology, they're not going to change their views. You want to catch all the other people, the ordinary people, the normal people, the people who are outside, who believe that they are outside of politics, but their lives are still very much affected by politics. Those are the people you want to target to explain what's going on. But to get to the question, most of those people stuck with the lies for the reasons that I said. They, not the Nazis told them that they could rape and pillage and murder across Europe. Then they did it. And they had blood on their hands. In small ways or in large ways, they collaborated. And once they have the blood on their hands, it's like the mafia. You never leave the family, right? You're committed to it. And that moment, that is the crucial moment, is when they believed the lies that were being told to them as strong truths, right? That they said, this is not something that someone's telling me that I need to think critically about. This is really true about who I am. That moment is when they committed to the fascist social contract.
We've heard some comparisons to that about Project 2025, that people now in hindsight said they didn't believe that the administration really meant what they said. That's kind of a parallel to what you're saying right now.
I think that this is a human nature kind of thing, that we have a tendency to believe the things people say about us because we want to believe those things are true. I, as a Jewish American, I can understand why Aryan people would be, oh yeah, I'm superior, I'm better than everyone else. I can understand, I can feel that specialness. Even though, the members of my family were the victims of that dynamic, I can understand the human tendency to want to believe when someone tells you that you're special, that you really believe you're special.
Mm. Another question was, how can we fight misinformation when the opposition has so many resources to help them get the misinformation out? Are there parallels?
I was intentionally not talking about the question of the actual lies. I do believe that we need institutions that debunk the lies that people say. I think that's a free press is absolutely essential in the healthy functioning of a civil society, and their main role is to debunk lies that people say. That's absolutely true. Um, I was going from the premise of, what do you do if you don't have those institutions? What do you as an individual do? How do you pay attention to those circumstances where someone is asking you to self-deceive yourself so that you can collaborate? And that's the way that we have to, I think, we as individuals, we can have collective action, we can have institutions, super important for the defense of democracy. We also have to have everyday practices and behaviors that are going to protect us as well as individuals, and make sure that we can make the kinds of choices that we're going to be able to live up to later in our lives.
Another question is, do you think people don't care that they're being lied to?
I think there were material and psychological and social and economic benefits to collaboration. That's what Nazis do. In the words of sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, they solicit the aid even of the victims in their own victimization. They create irrational choices where it makes more sense to collaborate than not, even though the logical outcome of your collaboration will lead to your own destruction or death. So a wonderful book here is Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocaust, where he outlines this dynamic, and it is really one of the most chilling parts of the way the Nazis operated, is the way that they solicited the aid of their victims. I'll always remember a woman that helped me a lot when I was doing my research. Her name was Dr. Christa Borstede in the town of Hildesheim. She was a personal assistant, help for me in getting myself set up when I was living in Germany. And she came to hear some of these talks, some of the early research that I did on everyday life. And she said to me that afterwards, she said, she never understood. I'm remembering her because she recently died, so she's fresh in. Um, she said to me, I never understood how it was that I fell into their grasp, how I got caught up in this. And now I finally understood it. Thank you. I appreciate it. I don't think we look at everyday life with the same critical lens and our own actions and the same critical lens that we do criticize what the media says or what politicians say. So I'm encouraging us to have that same kind of critical reflection on the kinds of choices that we make in everyday life.
Thank you. Challenge accepted. We had a couple questions about rural America, and some people on the call seem to make some assumptions that rural Americans may be more likely than urban dwellers to believe untruths. Are there parallels to that in what you saw in Germany?
So there are parallels in the sense that there were different milieus in Germany, social milieus, and some supported the Nazis more than others, right? So the urban working class tended not to support the Nazis. The rural farmers tended to support the Nazis. There are many other distinctions I could make, but those were not universally true. But all of that is besides the point of my talk. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that all of us make ourselves deceivers. We all are. And we all want to be dupes to the people who lie to us, telling us the things that we want to hear. The difference between falling into a fascist social contract and not is whether we take the lies that people tell us and think critically about them and say, wait a minute, am I really the things? Do I want to be the things that they're telling me? Or do we accept those things as strong truths? Because the moment we do, we turn off our critical capacities, and now giving we are giving the lie mastery over us. And that's a political moment.
I really thank you for you. Critical thinking is coming up a lot in your comments. Another one is, what do you think is the root of distrust in the government?
Well, that's a gigantic question. I'm not sure it's exactly on topic, but I would say historically, one of the things that the Nazis did was they criticized democracy as a system that was dysfunctional and broken that they had to fix, and then they proceeded to break democracy. So one of the tactics of fascists is to claim that the other side is guilty of the very things that they are planning to do. And destroying law and order, destroying trust in government is one of the ways that you justify overthrowing government and changing and breaking the rule of law. So I think that that is the real danger. And we see that, I think, in a lot of propaganda.
Yes. So you had mentioned that Hans was incapable of action sometimes.
Yes.
And many Americans feel powerless right now. So what can we learn from Hans about being capable or incapable?
So what we can learn from Hans, first of all, is how much he sincerely regretted when he would later in life, when he finally realized that he had made himself into a passive person, that he actually had more agency than he thought, and he regretted it. And we don't want to be like Hans. We don't want to regret what we could have done later on. But this is complicated. There were risks for Hans if he had challenged the Hitler Youth, if he had refused to serve in the army. There would have been real consequences. So remember that when you're facing in a circumstance where you're facing a government that has enormous amounts of power, there are potential consequences. one of the big things that we tried to say about the book, that we tried to do with this book, and I would be happy to talk about the other chapters of this book in a future session with you if you're interested.
Of course.
One of the things that we said was that it's very easy, and even academics kind of fall into the mold of believing that there are certain recipes for fighting against fascism, that there's certain easy answers, that if you just do this, this is going to fix the problem. And the more we looked at it as existentialists, the more we said, no, that these are myths. There, a lie is not always bad. The truth is not always good. There are circumstances when anti-fascist resistance fighters had to lie and had to sincerely believe their lies in order to effectively be anti-fascist resistance fighters. The question is not whether we self-deceive. The question is whether we self-deceive in order to stand on the side of the victims and recognizing that we also might be victims too.
Yes.
So we have to be fully aware of all the implications of what we're doing.
So Professor Drew, a couple of more questions to that point. So you're a historian. Most of us on the call are not. Will you share with us some titles of books that we can share with people on this call?
Well, the person who's doing a wonderful work on this is Tim Snyder. His book on tyranny. It's small, it's easy to digest. Janet, you and I discussed the possibility that we might do kind of a reading group in this group, reading Tim Snyder's work. He and I share many views. For instance, he has this concept of anticipatory collaboration and or collusion, and that's very close to my notion of anticipatory memories. He is, of course, much more famous. He's at Yale, and I'm not. But the reality is that that would be the first tech book that I would recommend. If you're interested in the way that the Nazi system kind of encouraged people to collaborate, then the book by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. It's an older book, but I loved it, and it was really very helpful for me as well. It's called Modernity and the Holocaust.
One more question here. Somebody wants to know, in order to avoid becoming dupes or to convert dupes, is it necessary to invalidate the experience of a few?
So I think the most effective tool in changing the minds of Germans, if we were to look historically over the course of 20 or 30 years, I would say the most effective tool in changing their mind was the bombing of Hamburg and the defeat at Stalingrad. In other words, I think when people have become part of a criminal conspiracy and they have lied to themselves that they fully believe the things that this conspiracy is saying, it requires a kind of a scale of a disaster of an enormous scope before they say, no, this is crazy, I can't keep doing this. The other thing that was very successful in changing the minds of many Germans was the economic miracle in the post-war Germany. That was a collaboration between the democratic capitalist forces, social democratic forces in West Germany, and along with the United States in the Marshall Plan. And by giving people homes and refrigerators and cars and ensuring that they had jobs, but in other words, by actually fixing social problems. That is the best way to fight fascism, is showing that the alternative system, some kind of democratic socialism, is a better system of government because the people are going to thrive under it. So I think people make very rational choices in those circumstances. But I think the questioner was asking something else. On an individual level, what enables you to convince someone? And I think for me, storytelling is a good one. This is why I'm the historian of everyday life. I tell stories about ordinary people so that people can identify with the actual circumstances and the challenges that real people faced. And I think in those stories, we can connect with them. They operate a little bit like a myth, but as opposed to a myth that is a myth that's intending us to not understand the world. It's a way of, it's a hermeneutic. It's a way of thinking through the problem that helps us to make our own choices in everyday life.
Thank you. That's, do you think part of the confusion we have now is because Americans are a little bit light on history?
I can't ignore that fact that Americans are light on history. And that certainly is true. But I do not believe that history teaches lessons. I think history is a Rorschach's ink block test where people make things out of it that they want. What history does teach is a method for critically analyzing sources and for determining what we can reliably say about the past. And it also teaches that the world is not always the way it is today. And in those functions, I think history operates best to help people make the kinds of choices that they would want to make themselves.
So I wonder, 20 years from now, is that long enough for this time of our life to be history? Wonder what historians are going to be saying about us. I know you don't want to talk about this, but
that certainly is a good question. But historians see things in very long-term measures. I remember an archivist who said to me once that modern history begins with the printing press because that's what changed everything. So, you know, living memory will be with us for another 100 years. And it's only after living memory disappears that historians can begin starting to make sense of some of those events. We're only now starting to rethink the 20th century in a way that's breaking out of the old categories of Cold War thinking and World War II thinking.
Martha, do you have anything, any other questions or comments to add?
No, I think that was amazing. I think that the historical perspective is really something that we're not examining enough. I think we keep saying, what do we do? What do we do? As opposed to looking back and understanding how we deal with it. So I think that is really an amazing part of this. And I would love to invite you, Professor Drew, for another session on this, and we can more fully explore sort of the next phase of this topic. So
Sure.
if you're willing,
I would be happy to. So the book has several chapters. One's called Nonconformity, one's called Irony. And I have some other work that I'd be happy to share with you. And we could also do a discussion of books like Tim Snyder or Zygmunt Bauman if your readers are interested. This is I think important work, and we need to create spaces where people can have these conversations. And I think that I think it helps to have someone who, my role as a public historian is not to tell you what to think, but is to help you to have the tools so that you can think for yourself. So
it's exactly
Well
what we need.
said. And thank you
I
also.
will say that this whole webinar and Professor Drew's notes are going to be posted on our website, which is bootsonthegroundmidwest.org. So give us a day to get it up there, but it will be posted up there, and we'll keep you posted on our next session with Professor Drew.
There are lots of hearts and claps and thumbs up floating
thank
on
you
the
for the opportunity.
screen.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience.
You surpassed our expectations, which I had very high expectations. So we thank you, and we'll be in touch to take advantage of your kind offers.
Thank you. And thank you, Janet. And thanks to everybody that attended. This was awesome.
Yes. And good night.
Everyone.